Welcome to our second episode of Meet the Lichens, a series of videos to help you learn to recognize some common lichens. As I mentioned in the first video, this series is focused on the San Francisco Bay Area and Northern California, but many of these lichens actually have a global distribution, so you can certainly use this as a resource if you live somewhere else. All right, the first thing we're going to do is have a quick quiz on the lichens we learned last time, our city dwellers. All right, first up, what's this sort of lemon lime Gatorade sort of colored lichen? It's very common on street trees, and it mostly reproduces asexually via soredia. All right, next up, how about this gray-green little guy with tiny lobes and often with dark brown apothecia? Finally, how about this yellow-orange lichen with, if you look close, dark orange apothecia? All right, answers. If you guessed Candelaria and then Fuchsia and then Xanthoria, you are right. Great job. Okay, so today in this video we have 4 new lichens to learn. Like these 3, they're also pretty pollution tolerant and very common in the Bay Area. While you're less likely to see them on your average urban street tree than you are these 3 here that we already learned, you're pretty likely to find them in a local park. Not so much like a tiny urban park, but like a bigger one with more vegetation that's near the city. For example, I've seen most of these covering the trees in Leona Canyon Open Space Preserve, which is a park just behind the Merritt College campus in Oakland, popular with dog walkers. So that kind of place. And these lichens that we're going to see, they all tend to form bigger thalli than our first 3, with bigger and more obvious features that make them relatively easy to identify with the naked eye. Unlike last time, we're going to learn 3 out of 4 of these to species and not just genus, since for these there's really only one main species in the genus that's common in this area. And these species tend to be pretty common ones elsewhere as well. All right, let's get started. All right, so first up is Evernia Pronastery, which is also known as oak moss. It's one of the most common lichens in California and in other places. It's common in agricultural areas and hardwood forests alike. It mostly grows on the bark of trees and shrubs, not just on oaks despite its common name, but mostly on hardwoods. A note, hardwood is a term for a non-coniferous, non-evergreen tree, also known as a deciduous tree in other places, but in California these trees may not actually lose their leaves, so hardwood is a better term. They're trees that are in the flowering plants group. Anyway, side note, but getting back to the Evernia. So Evernia Pronastery is usually considered a foliose lichen, a leafy lichen, though it's sometimes grouped with the fruticose lichens because it is shrubby and 3-dimensional like most fruticose lichens. In some books, like the Charnoff Lichens of California book, it is grouped with fruticose lichens. But we're going to consider it a foliose lichen because it meets the technical definition, which is that it has a distinct upper and lower cortex, distinct upper and lower sides. And the upper cortex is a pale green, while the lower cortex is whitish, paler than the upper cortex. And that white can look sort of thin, almost powdery, like it doesn't fully cover the green, but you can usually make out the difference between the top and bottom, that one is greener and the other is more pale. And this is Evernia's most distinctive feature. It's really a giveaway that this is Evernia and not one of its fruticose lookalikes that may also have flattened lobes, but those will be the same color on both sides. Evernia has these really soft, fairly thin, flattened branches, and they branch in a way that's called dichotomously. That's like if you look at any branch, that branch splits into 2 relatively even branches, which then splits into 2 relatively even branches, and so on until the smallest branch. And you can actually use these branches to age this lichen. It's thought to split once a year, so each junction represents a year, which is pretty cool. And Evernia, often they'll have a gray or greenish soredia, but they're pretty sparse and they're not the most obvious character. And apothecia are very rare in this species. In Evernia, another cool fact is it's probably the world's most economically important lichen, since it is used commercially to make a fixative in perfume, other ingredients in perfume sometimes, though that may be occurring a little less due to changes in the perfume industry. It is also used in dyeing as well. All right, lookalikes. So Evernia's main lookalike in the Bay Area is the genus Ramalina. We're going to talk about one Ramalina, Ramalina menziesii lace lichen, next week, which is a really distinctive lichen. But most Ramalinas look sort of like this one on the left. They're small, shrubby things, about the same size as Evernia a lot of the time, with similar flattened lobes. The easy way to tell these apart is to look for those two different colors on either side of the lobe. Ramalinas are the same on both sides. They look the same on both sides, while Evernia has those two different colors. And the lobes of Ramalina are also a bit thicker and tougher, while Evernias are sort of a little flimsier. On the right there, we also have Niebla, which is another Bay Area lookalike in some areas. It also is fruticose, doesn't have those distinct sides. All right, next up is Usnea, sometimes called beard lichens or old man's beard for certain kinds of species. And Usnea is actually a huge group of lichens, a genus, with many, many species that can have a lot of variable features. Some species are distinctive and really easy to identify because of their size or their reproductive features, and others are really very difficult to identify. So we're going to stick at the genus level here. We're going to stick with Usnea. And Usnea species are fruticose lichens. They're distinguished by these round cylindrical branches. They can look small and shrubby, or they can be really long and pendulous, like a photo we'll see in a minute. Like the most famous Usnea species are like old man's beard, Usnea longissima. It's really long, and that's found mostly in the Northwest, but can be found in parts of Northern California. So we'll see a photo of that in a minute. This is a shrubbier one in the picture. And they're mostly found on bark and twigs, both trees and shrubs. And in general, the smaller, tuftier ones like this are more widespread and more pollution tolerant, while the longer ones are found in areas with better air quality. So a distinguishing feature for Usneas are if you carefully break a branch open, you can see this elastic central cord in this photo. It's usually white. It's not elastic like a rubber band, but it has a lot more give and take than the rest of the cortex. And this is a distinguishing feature for this genus. The majority of Usnea species are pale yellow-green due to the presence of usnic acid. But two species are reddish, including one that can be found in the Bay Area that's pictured here. And a brief note here, if you remember the last video, I mentioned that yellow-green has a particular meaning in the lichen world, especially in lichen keys. And it refers to this type of pale yellowish-green color from usnic acid that we're going to see in these Usnea photos, except for this red one here, and also in a couple of the later species today. And in general, Usnea species, the surface can be smooth or it can be rough. If it's rough, it can have these little bumps called papillae or short little side branches called fibrils. They're sort of Usnea specific terms, but it's not that important to know. Soredia and cilia, your asexual reproductive structures, are common, but they can be hard to distinguish from other little bumpy things, the little structures called papillae and fibrils. Apothecia, like these cool ones seen in this picture, are common in some species, including this distinctive species called Usnea intermedia, but they are absent in most California species. And in general, most Usneas reproduce asexually through fragmentation. As I mentioned a little bit before, Usneas contain something called usnic acid, which is a topical antibiotic, although some people can be allergic to it. They're popular with birds as a nesting material, and they have been used for lichen dyes and also for tanning leather. Usneas are pretty distinctive, but they do have some lookalikes. Two similarly hairy fruticose lichens are Alectoria and Brioria. Brioria is usually darker in color, and both of these other genera, they lack that distinctive central elastic cord. So if you break it open, you should be able to tell for sure. And from a distance, you might confuse Ramalina menziesii in that right picture there, lace lichen, with a long pendulous species of Usnea, like old man's beard. But up close, they're really very different. Ramalina has these flat lobes with these little distinctive nets instead of Usnea's round cylindrical branches. All right, our last two lichens of the day are really close lookalikes. They're both very, very common in the Bay Area, and they can even grow side by side, making it difficult to tell them apart without a chemical test. So first up is Flavoparmelia caparata. Flavoparmelia is a medium to large yellow-green lichen. It's foliose with wide, round lobes, usually about 3 to 8 millimeters wide. That's the lobes, not the whole thing. Its color can change pretty dramatically when wet, from a pale yellow-green to a much deeper green when it's wet. And it is this light yellow-green in color, similar to Usnia, because it contains that same substance, usnic acid. It's quite common on bark, especially oaks, sometimes on rocks. It's also common on fences and roof shingles. If you're able to look at the lower surface is black with black rhizines. And it has granular or wart-like soredia, especially in the older central parts of the thallus. The lichen grows outward from the center, so the middle is the oldest. And apothecia are quite rare on these. All right, this is a different lichen, our last lichen, which, as I said before, is very, very similar. So this is Flavopunctelia flaviantor. Flavoparmelia, Flavopunctelia, they have similar names, similar lichens. It can be very confusing. So in the field, it's really just great if you can narrow it down to one of these two. You can call them the flavos. And like Flavoparmelia, Flavopunctelia is a yellow-green or green, medium to large, foliose lichen with wide lobes. It's also very common on bark, sometimes rocks. It also has a black lower surface with rhizines. It also has granular soredia. So far, these two species sound pretty much identical. How do you tell them apart? There are two features Flavopunctelia has that can help you set them apart in the field, though they are not always super obvious to the eye, and they're not totally dependable, but they can be useful. So one is the presence of something called Pseudocythillae, which are these small white breaks in the upper cortex. This is a relatively obvious feature, and I use it to remember which is which. Also, Flavopunctelia has punctures in the cortex, but it can sometimes be hard to tell if these markings are Pseudocythillae or they're just cracks, especially in older specimens. And not every specimen of Flavopunctelia will have them anyway. Another feature you can use is that the soredia in this species are found on the lobe margins and not just in the sort of more in the middle on the lobe surfaces. And the color can also be useful. So the color in Flavopunctelia tends to be a little darker, a little bluer shade of green. But this isn't really a very dependable feature unless you've got them side by side. Then sometimes you can sort of be like, oh, you know, these are different colors, and these are probably two different things. If you're not content calling it just a flavo in the field, the most definitive way to distinguish them is with a chemical spot test. The chemical test for Flavoparmelia and Flavopunctelia is actually one of the easier ones to do because the main chemical you use is bleach. That's the C test. And so what you do is if you scrape off a little of the cortex to expose the white medulla underneath, and you put a little drop of bleach on that exposed medulla of Flavopunctelia, it turns red briefly. Flavoparmelia doesn't have that reaction. So if you got to know for sure, you can try that. All right, other lookalikes. So the Flavo's most important lookalikes are each other, but you might also confuse these species with lichens in the genera Parmelia, Parmotrema, or Punctelia, and some others. Both of those, the Flavos, Flavoparmelia and Flavopunctelia, they tend to have wider lobes and form bigger thalli than these species. The Flavos are also more yellowish green than these other species, which are a little more gray or a little more blue. All right, that's all for today. We'll do a quick review here. Evernia is green on top, white on the bottom. Usnia is round with that central cord. And then we got our Flavos. They're big and yellow-green, but Flavopunctelia has Pseudocythillae and reacts with bleach, while Flavoparmelia does not. All right, continue to go forth and lichenize, and I'll see you next time.